Welcome to part one of our second series of Working the Word. And you're going to be looking at me and saying, Ken, you don't sound right. Yeah, I did something not very smart this week. I didn't think. I was working on the house and I was using an electric sander. And dust masks work really well.
When you wear them.
If you wear them. And so I took a fair load of dust on board, and then I started to sneeze. And then my throat didn't like all the sneezing. So I'm sounding not quite my usual self today. But that sort of reminds me that sometimes we don't take time to stop and to think, to pause before we actually do things.
And sometimes that works out, sometimes that doesn't work out.
And really that sort of leads into where we're going today. But maybe we ought to start out with a disclaimer that we're making no pretense to be experts in this field.
No, very much not.
An expert knows more and more about less and less until eventually they know everything about nothing. And we don't find ourselves in that position.
And I think one of the things is continuing to, in terms of the journey that we're going through preparing this, there's very much a continuing to look for new things that we're learning and such, that it's not a, expanding all the things, the wisdom that we have. It's that, we're spending time in here looking for more because we know that there is more to find.
And I guess it probably doesn't hurt for them to know that there's about 20 hours of preparation goes into one of these.
At least.
These presentations. What we would say is beware of people who come to you as if they know it all.
Because the chances are that they either are working on an agenda or that they don't know very much, because it tends to be something that the more you understand and the more you know, the more you realise that you don't know about the subject.
It's like when man went to the moon, and it answered a whole lot of questions.
But it provided a whole lot of more.
They got more new questions than they got answers
Yes.
to their old ones. And this is the way it is with learning. The more that you learn, the more you realise that there is to learn.
And I think even just in matters of faith, and when you're studying the Bible, coming to it with an approach that there always is more to learn, keeps us in sort of a good mindset to be actually hearing and understanding what God's trying to say to us.
To realise we're on a journey. And that brings a degree of humility because we don't know what's around the corner.
And like what we know now is a lot more than we knew then, but what we know now we probably weren't ready for back then.
So come with us on a journey of discovery as we explore in this series what it looks like to be God's people in the world. And we're going to bounce a lot out of the book of Acts because they too were going through this kind of journey.
And I think there's a lot of that we can kind of gain from their experience. That they've just, they've got this background of the Old Testament that, they've all known. And then they've spent all this time with Jesus, or spending time with people who spent time with Jesus. And they're kind of trying to synthesize all this and figure out what this looks like and how to actually live it.
So they had the Hebrew scriptures, and there was what they knew of them. And they had pointed forward to Jesus, but they had also talked about how God had acted down through the ages.
And so, they've got these generational stories that have been passed down through them as their stories of their people. But there's also these little hints about God that are just, now that they've spent time with Jesus, are starting to make a little bit more sense. And through some of the Acts and the epistles, you're starting to see this progression of how their understanding is growing and adapting to the situations that God has placed them in.
And so they don't just rush out into the world. And Jesus tells them, stay in Jerusalem. Don't go anywhere until I open the way.
Which can be a really difficult thing. When something exciting has just happened, I think Jesus dying and coming back to life is pretty exciting. Like there's a lot to process there, because that's just a lot. But the kind of temptation would be to immediately run off and start talking. Like, once this is new and exciting and good news, you sort of want to run off and start straight away.
And Peter had plenty of mileage on his mouth.
He did.
And who knows how it would have come out. And so God told them they needed to wait. They needed to allow time. And they had to think about their time with Jesus and to have those aha moments. Oh, that prophecy, that fits in there.
And you've got, this is the time that the gospel writers are starting to kind of think about compiling, in the next sort of few years, think about compiling the gospels. So some of their little notes, that this was connected to this prophecy, or this is what Jesus meant when he said this, some of those are going to be coming from those aha moments.
And all of this takes
it
takes time. If you want to rush a task, this is not one that can be rushed.
And sometimes it's hard for us to remember that it takes time, particularly if it's someone else. That we can kind of be a little bit patient with ourselves, but then when we've found it, sometimes we want everyone else to know now.
Yes, and it brings a lady to mind who had first heard about a particular Bible truth when she was 8 years old. And when she turned 63, it suddenly went ding, and she said, oh, wow, this is exciting. And she started to practice this truth and wondered why her daughter couldn't see it in 3 weeks. Sometimes we need to allow time. And so they were told, wait in Jerusalem. And I'm sure there was a lot of reflection about God's leading in Jesus' life, God's leading down through the Old Testament period.
Even God's leading in their lives. They've personally experienced, they've been through this. They've each have their own unique perspective of what they've learned and understood talking with Jesus and learning from Jesus. And so I'd kind of love to hear some of those discussions where they're sort of bouncing off each other and kind of, unpacking some of what's gone on.
And possibly some misunderstandings that they were straightening out. As God was preparing them to do a work, he didn't just say, rush out and do it. He said, take time, reflect. And I think reflective practice is a very helpful thing.
Very much.
Just looking back and saying, how has God been active in human history? Because he was here before we got here.
Yes. Even if you think about creation, God's come down, we don't know when the beginning was. We've just got this picture that at some point God stepped in to this earth that was formless and empty and started creating and making something out of it. And he spends, he makes space, and then he fills that space. And then after it's all done, God has already been at work for 6 days. After it's all done, we turn up. That, he's already been actively investing and working and preparing before we even get here.
And when you come to the Sabbath, basically man's first day is a time of reflection rather than rushing out and going gung-ho in the garden.
It's not here's your first day, get to work. It's here's your first day. Well, the first thing I want you to do is stop and reflect and get to know the character of God. That sort of stop, reflect, wait, see what God is doing is kind of central to the way God seems to work.
And it's something that humanity has been very slow to grab.
Yes.
I think of Abraham and Abimelech. It was one of Abraham's she is my sister moments. And he had come there and he thought, well, look, this place is pretty scary. And he's all fearful. Abimelech has God come and say to him, and Abraham sort of thinks he's bringing God to town, and Abimelech already has a knowledge of. And the number of times where God has gone ahead.
Yes. Melchizedek is another one of those.
Melchizedek's another one. Ruth is another one. Joseph. Mm-hmm. You know, this scary place, Egypt. God has sent someone ahead of there. Yeah, through a little bit of a troubled experience.
I mean, even, if you're thinking about the children of Israel, that, they've just been miraculously rescued, walking through the sea. Like, there's been all these miracles accompanying them. And yet when they get to the promised land, they kind of panic and like, we can't do this. Like, there's this complete forgetting of what God can do. And I think that sort of, we're so really quick to kind of take on ourselves what we can do and go, whoa, we can't do that without, and sort of forget what God can do. And I think that's where that some of the, Abraham and Abimelech, if Abraham sort of sat back and thought about his relationship with God, he probably wouldn't have been quite so scared about what might happen.
So in this series, as we think about the God that we have, the God that we share, we want to begin by being a little bit reflective that in the Bible, God was normally there ahead of time. And it was us catching up to him. Not us saying, well, God, this is what we're going to do. God, please bless it. Part of this also comes through in those miraculous moments when something that shouldn't be able to happen happens. And we call them miracles. It might be worthwhile just reflecting. In your life, are there moments that you look back and say, hey, wow, God was there? That was something just that little bit out of the ordinary.
And I think it can be really easy sometimes not to take that time to sit back and think. Like, if there's something, there'll be a couple of moments that that it hits you at the moment, like, whoa, that was a God moment. That was pretty cool. But there's other times that if you sit and look back, you're like, actually, there was a few in there that I didn't really realize. And it's not until we take the time to sit and look for them often that we see them.
And to realize it's not just us that happens for. That God is near to everybody. But to pause and remember those special, miraculous God moments is something that's really important when it comes to having something to talk about.
And like having an understanding of your own journey. And like, once we've got a little bit more of an understanding of our own journey, we're a lot more placed to be having an understanding of other people's journeys. Because, where other people are at are going to be at a different spot to you because God's leading them in the way he's leading them, not in the way he's leading you.
Yeah. You also have those awe moments. And I remember one dark night, we'd been working all day and a couple of us went outside and we looked up and we looked at the stars and they just shone in a brilliant fashion. And we said, wow, our God made all of that. Oh, wow. And it was just one of those awe moments.
And I think sometimes, it can be a really healthy thing to really regularly take time to sit in that wonder and awe. That it's not about, us performing or anything we're doing. It's not even necessarily about, investing all this time in the relationship and learning this and kind of thing. That it's, that attitude of just sitting and being in awe and wonder at what God is doing, I think is a really healthy thing for us to do, but something that we don't actually do a lot, I don't think. Like, we just stopping, even just sitting outside in nature and going, wow.
Yeah, and a lot of us are nature deprived. And then there are just those circumstances where it is clear that something's being orchestrated.
You can kind of feel like this piece is moving into place. You can't see where it's going yet, but you can kind of see it's just sort of things are falling into place and just something feels planned about this, not by accident.
And you have sequences of events. I remember a health challenge that I was experiencing, and then for some reason our son got put into hospital with a suspected problem. And while he was there, my wife met up with another lady who was very anxious about her husband and his health. And she started to talk, and Cheryl said, oh, yeah, he does this and this and this. And the lady looked and said, how do you know? And our son never had that issue again. And was that us being put in the right place to help somebody? It's one of those intriguing little moments when you say, oh, wow, God is at work in our world.
And particularly even before we're looking for him, that, he's already in there working, and sometimes we bumble in and feel like we're bringing God to this situation, but God's kind of already been in there orchestrating and setting and making the backdrop. And
so it would do us well to take some time to say, well, I'm not bringing God there. God's already there. Yeah? There's no one in the planet that God isn't working on, interested in. God's already doing things.
And so it becomes more of a question of, where is God already working here? So we're sitting back and reflecting and thinking about the people we're working with and interacting with as people that God is already working in their lives. And if you're making that assumption, you're kind of looking to see where that's happening. And it's more about jumping on board with what God is already doing than us having to kind of figure out all the solutions.
And not getting in the road.
Yes.
Easy to do. So knowledge of God is there, and God is working in all places if we can tap into it.
And I mean, there's plenty of examples in the Old Testament that these guys would have had to look back to. There's, in Psalms, there's they're talking about, there's a psalm that it's a call and response where you give thanks to the Lord for He's good, His love endures forever, and the people would have responded with His love endures forever. And you've got this progression through their story. And when you get to verse 16, to Him who led His people through the desert, His love endures forever. This is their story. You've got Deuteronomy where the Lord Himself goes before you when Moses is commissioning Joshua, essentially, just, the do not be afraid, be strong and courageous, for the Lord goes before you. We've got evidence, there's another place in the Psalms where the psalmist is talking about you go before me and follow me. So it's kind of being hemmed in. But this idea of the Lord going before you, it is really strong. Even when you get to, the resurrection, the disciples are told, He will go ahead of you into, is it Galilee?
Yes.
That you've kind of got God setting the agenda and God setting the pace at each step of the way.
And that's often a problem, that we want to run our agenda. And this question, what's God already doing, is such a helpful one when we come into that context. But it can't be rushed.
And I think sometimes it can feel like a really passive thing, but I think it's actually a really active thing to be looking, where is God working, and just sort of taking time to appreciate and understand the situation before diving in.
And certainly Paul understood this concept because as he began Romans, he talked about what can be known about God is plain to them. And he's not talking about just religious people, he's talking about the world. Because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse.
And I think one of the things, particularly as you start progressing through Acts, you've got the disciples really grappling with, there's the us and them, really. that kind of cognitively they understood that the gospel was for the Gentiles as well. But they also kind of had a, like, we'll stay here and figure this out and look after the Jews first. Sort of, I wonder whether it almost felt like the Gentiles were just too foreign and too big of a problem to deal with, not understanding that God was actually ahead of them working in the Gentiles. And that, you know, there was evidence of his fingerprints even before they got there.
So we're going to come to Philip and the eunuch. And the eunuch's already had access to the scriptures.
He's reading Isaiah as he's going along.
Surprise, surprise.
I think it's another one of those God-orchestrated moments that, you know, Philip was put there at that time for a really specific reason, and it may not have been apparent until the Ethiopian came along reading. And I'm pretty sure Philip is actually one of the ones that's sort of most willing to dive in and work with the Gentiles, and kind of afterwards the rest of the disciples like, oh, okay, and sort of was consolidating his work. But he's one of the few that really is willing to kind of step forward and just...
He's one of the early ones.
But again, it's very much still in that spirit of waiting for God to make the first move.
And God guided him, said, go here, and then God took him somewhere else. Maybe Peter and Cornelius is another
example of God really sort of setting the pace and setting the agenda for how this was to go.
And I wonder, in light of that God is setting up these encounters, how we should be praying. And we want to spend a whole lesson on the subject of praying. But, you know, if God is going ahead, perhaps our prayers will be different.
And I think one of the other things to really understand here is that, like, yes, God was preparing Peter to be able to be a blessing to Cornelius and to, you know, to be to be able to reach him. But at the same time, God is also working on Peter. So it's not just that God is preparing Peter for this. God is working on Peter as well, that this is part of Peter's progression. And sometimes we look at this as in terms of what God is designing us to do in other people's lives, but instead of kind of, you know, it also being in what God is doing in our life.
So Peter was on a journey. And he had some bumps along the journey. Paul was on a journey. And we too are on probably fairly bumpy journeys. But even without a written record, the book of nature talks about God. It's not a perfect record. There are the effects of sin that mar it. But its complexity, its interconnectedness, talk of wisdom, talk of power, talk of a God that we need to be careful we don't have too small a picture of God.
And I think one of the things that can be really hard to wrap your head around when you're, particularly if you're looking at a very sort of fixed idea, is that God is much bigger than, like, you know, he doesn't just live in the church and we visit him once a week kind of thing, that he's much bigger than that. He's out there doing things and being surprising in ways that we never see coming.
And maybe that's one of the issues also that reflection will help us to think about. And
also just that often, like, we kind of flip the, you know, God making us in his image. Often we have a picture of God in our image. And if we've got God limited to the little box we've put him in, then we're going to miss a whole bunch of the things he's doing.
And this is something that also took Bible characters time to realise. Jacob, after he had pinched his brother's birthright, was fleeing, and he overnighted at Bethel, where he put his head on a rock for a pillow. And God showed up. And so he puts up a pillow. Oh, wow, you know, God was here. And it just took a little while to realise that God is more than just here.
I mean, there is something to be said for marking that this was an important moment and kind of having that as a marker. But at the same time, like God being in this spot really isn't noteworthy because he's in all the spots.
Mm-hmm.
And that, even when he's gone a long way from home, it doesn't mean he's gone a long way from God. And I think sometimes that can be a hard thing to wrap your head around when you're going through all the really human emotions of...
And that God could speak to him there as well as back where he had come from.
Let alone, that God could speak to, like, people who weren't like him.
Mm.
And, like, when you've got cases of God using, non-Jewish, non-Hebrew people for his purpose, it kind of blows their mind just a little bit because that's not how they expected him to work.
And we could also think of the time of Samuel, that they took the Ark of the Covenant out to battle because they thought they had God locked into the box. And if they took God in the box, then they were going to win. And they discovered that you can't manipulate God like that.
And, it's not the first or last time where it's, kind of been this idea of God is on our side and we're going to bring him with us and he will help us win without sort of taking the time to consult with God as to what his wishes actually were. And it's, I think, one of the really damaging things that can be done in his name in that, if we're launching off on our own agendas and just sort of assuming that God's coming along for the ride, then we can do some really damaging things to people's picture of God in that because we're not taking the time to sort of think, is this actually what God is trying to do here, or is this kind of us getting in the way with our agenda, particularly when some of those agendas have been used for harmful or oppressive things.
Things we don't talk about.
And yet, like, the picture of God that we are giving in that is incredibly damaging.
An interesting story in the first missionary journey of Paul. He had a fair number of kicked out of towns before he gets to Lystra.
To be fair, Paul kind of has an interesting personality that tends to sometimes rub people just a little bit the wrong way.
But it's interesting, in the early part of Acts, Peter and John go to the temple to pray and there's a blind man on the way and they give him back his sight. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those God moments that gives the opportunity for a lot of Jewish people to receive Jesus.
And I think because they had spent that time kind of consolidating and thinking and reflecting and allowing God to shape them, when God dumped a usable moment in their lap, they were able to kind of just jump on it and go, yes, okay, we can make use of this. Mm-hmm. And so you've got this very much God being able to just kind of put them there and give them their...
So here is a man sitting at the gate. He could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth. One imagines that his muscles are not in any good condition. He had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking. And Paul looked intently at him, and seeing that he had faith to be made well, he said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking.
Which, I mean, is a pretty much like, even if like your legs are sort of healed, as a kid, walking takes a bit of time to learn, like just the muscular coordination and being able to sort of figure out how it all works. Mm-hmm. Even if you've been watching people doing it your whole life, it doesn't mean that you just sort of would necessarily naturally know how to do it. So the fact that he springs up and begins walking, considering, the muscle waste, the muscles wouldn't have been great, that, the healing isn't just kind of the functional, the healing is also in the giving him the ability to go all the way.
And the crowds are pretty amazed with what they see. And they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." And they were pretty sure it was a couple of their gods because they called Barnabas Zeus and Paul, he got named Hermes because apparently Hermes spoke and Zeus just sent the thunder and lightning.
And Paul did tend to be a little bit more of the speaker.
And the priest of Zeus gets pretty excited about it all. He brings oxen and flowers. They are going to really decorate. They're going to offer sacrifices.
I mean, if the gods turn up in human form, then that's a pretty exciting day for the village.
Does that suggest that maybe they were expecting gods to show up? That God has actually put it into the heart of people that, you can expect that the gods will appear, and they've been expecting it, and it looks like it's arrived.
And there's heaps of these kind of stories. If you look at some of the early cultures around the world, that they have some of these traditions of a book that we once had, but it got lost, and someday somebody's going to bring it back to us. Mm-hmm. Or you've got cultures that are keeping things that look really similar to the Jewish feasts, or that have this idea of the one creator God or the one God most high. Or you've got a lot of these places within the culture where they're looking for God to be turning up.
And the flood stories. Mm-hmm. All over the world, as if there's a global memory of something major that...
And a lot of them have, creation stories that have similarities.
Yeah.
And clearly not all of them, but a lot of them have even just sort of, somewhere in our history, there's been a God that's been a part of, so that when you're turning, we'll come to a story in a couple of minutes, but, when you sort of turn up with God, it's not necessarily the first time he's been there.
And I think that's important. If you take nothing else away other than this presentation, that we need to be looking for where God is already at work and not thinking that there's no concept here and we have to
build from scratch. And I think sometimes that can be damaging because our building from scratch tends to be recreating more like us. Mm-hmm. Rather than looking to grow faith within that context.
So they had a little bit of a challenge here. Barnabas and Paul heard of it. They were horrified. Tear your garments. And they rushed out into the crowd crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news. That you should turn from these vain things to serve a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them."
And one of these things these guys are absolutely amazing at doing is just pointing people back again and again to, when they're doing healings, just pointing people again back to, no, look at God. It's not me, look at God. And I think that sort of key focus at keeping God at the center and his, working on his agenda and his moving rather than...
And they are coming on an equality. We've got good news, but we are people just like you.
Yeah.
We're on a journey, you're on a journey, join us on the journey.
And one of the things that can often get in the way of really being there for people and, listening to them and just... if somebody's going through a hard time, is taking away that equality. That, even if I have been through the exact same experience, I can't know what it's like for the other person to go through that. And so I have to kind of keep pulling myself out of the way, that I'm not the expert here. Even if I've been through this before, I can use that to inform my empathy as to how I'm talking to the person. But even if I have been through this before, I'm still not an expert. And you've got to keep that equality for the real deep communication to be able to happen, in that you can't have... they might want somebody to just sort of authoritatively tell them what to do, but it's not necessarily what they need.
And Paul carries on. And I think this is the interesting part to reflect on. in past generations, he allowed all the earth to walk in their own ways. So God wasn't unaware when his intended modes of communication got a little bit muddled along the way.
Like we have this sort of little narrow band of record of, God's dealing with the Hebrew people. But it doesn't necessarily, we don't know what was happening elsewhere.
We know that, for example, sacrifice was widespread. Mm-hmm. Somehow it had wandered off into the gods are hungry rather than we are grateful to the God for what we've got.
But a lot of that comes out of the context of relationship. That if you don't have a relationship with God, you're kind of guessing. Mm-hmm. And I think, if you're trying to deal with these gods that you don't really know that well and guess what's going to make them happy, then, it's going to be a bit hit and miss.
And probably more miss.
Yes.
And yet in verse 17, Paul says, yet he, that's God, did not leave himself without witness. Mm. That in every age and for every race, there has been a witness about God. Imperfect, but there are those who have responded to what they knew.
And in quite a few cases, when people did turn up with a more complete picture, if they were able to kind of be a little bit sort of reflective and, taking time to see where God might already be working, mm-hmm. they tended to quite often find people who, this was already a reasonably familiar concept and that was something they could build on.
We could add some more pieces to the puzzle.
Like we already know this and this is part of our heritage and culture. Tell us more. It's not I have this new thing to dump on you. It's like, wait, you've got more information about this thing that's us.
But God has left himself some hooks that things can be hung on.
Whereas sometimes if we're not taking time to see where God is already working, we miss the hooks.
We dump our information.
Yes. And some of that has been damaging. Like, if we're dumping culture, like there's people, in really, really tropical places who believe that it's disrespectful to go to a church without wearing a full suit. That, the way that God has been brought to these people hasn't kind of really looked to see how faith can be grown in that context. It is just sort of, this is what it looks like for us, so here.
So there's been a little bit of colonial transfer, even more than gospel transfer.
And that's one of the things that, it's happened and we have to kind of be reflective and think about because we haven't always got it right. Mm-hmm.
And yet God has been there behind the scenes and Paul sort of carries on. He did good by sending you rain from heaven, fruitful seasons, satisfying your heart with food and gladness.
And I think Paul is actually one of the ones who's reasonably good at looking and seeing where God is already at work. Now, maybe it's because he has a really strong awareness of just the way God has been at work in his life. I don't know. But he seems to be one of the ones who is a little more open to it.
Or maybe the fact that he grew up in Tarsus. He didn't grow up in Jerusalem. He was familiar with both sides of the equation. And we certainly see that in the next story. When Paul comes to Athens and the rest of his team is back at the last place, but he had to leave as usual in a hurry. And so he stands up in the middle of the Areopagus and says, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious."
This is actually quite sort of tame for Paul. Like, the way that he's basically perceived that they're very religious is they're a bit of a collector of gods. Like, they're sort of trying to have a statue to all the gods they can find so that, hedging their bets almost. And, there's sort of some background to this that we get. There's a couple of other writers that sort of provide some context here. That you've got this guy called Epimedes, who was a Cretan hero that... Nicias, I'm probably pronouncing these names terribly, but from Athens kind of, there was a plague and they would nothing they were doing was helping.
So
And
it was the middle of a pandemic.
in the middle of a pandemic, nothing they were doing was helping. And Nicias actually kind of suggested they send for Epimedes. And he turns up and sort of hears the situation and kind of says, meet me on Mars Hill in the morning, first thing in the morning with some sheep, like good quality sheep, multicolored, like black, white coloured, who haven't been allowed to graze. I'll see you in the morning, and kind of, get some rest because it's been a long journey. They turn up in the morning, and basically the idea is, this is the time they are the most hungry. And so he said, take the sheep out, and if any of them lie down and rest instead of grazing, then, make a marker. And basically the idea was that he was suggesting they give any of the rest of the gods an opportunity to show their willingness to help. And so if the sheep lay down, it was an indication that that god would accept them as an offering. And they were kind of, sitting there going, this is ridiculous. Some of these sheep haven't, it's as if the sheep are going to not eat. They're hungry. And a few of them lay down. And so they built altars, which is interesting because for all the other gods in the city, there were idols. But for this particular one, they built altars and sacrificed the sheep on them, and the plague went away. And so they kind of had a discussion that, we need to be honouring this god. And they didn't know who it was, so they built altars to the unknown god. And we know that Paul knew about this because there's a place he quotes somewhere in one of his writings talking about, even one of their own said, and quotes a poem by Epimedes. Mm-hmm. So we know that Paul knew about this when he turned up.
So God had left a hook there.
Yes.
For further development.
So, you've got these altered to the unknown God right in the middle of it all, which is part of their story that God has already worked in our story.
I wonder where God's working today. And if some reflection might actually help us.
I think so.
To see that.
And to first of all, stop and reflect and wait, rather than just kind of, trying to design all these wonderful plans or launching forward into how we're going to do all these changes or whatever. It's taking time to stop and see what God's agenda is and where he's already been preparing.
Yeah, and this gives Paul his opportunity. The God who made the world and everything in it. Back to the creation, the wise God, the powerful God, the God who loves things of beauty, the God who provides. Being Lord of heaven and earth does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one race every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God in the hope that they might feel their way towards him and find him. Yet he is actually not far from each of us.
And I think there's particularly at the end, this idea of people feeling their way towards him. That even when, there's not someone to show them the way, there's the ability to feel out and get a sense for even before.
That mankind has a hunger for God.
Essentially, that hunger comes from God in some ways, and that we don't hunger after something we don't know there is there.
And sometimes they are turned away from that too, because of messages that they get from God followers.
Yes. The concept of God that they're starting to feel out, that is a very good and patient and gracious and loving God, is kind of contradicted by these people who seem to apparently be following him but don't seem to be necessarily acting in that way.
Don't have the compassion, don't have the acceptance. I think it was Gandhi who was very attracted to Jesus. But the thing that kept him away from being a Christian? Christians.
And I think it's something we need to sort of be honestly aware of, because we don't always get it right, and sometimes when we get it wrong, it's damaging.
So we come back to the question that we asked. To take time to reflect, if God is already here, where is he at work? And how do we work in cooperation with what God is doing rather than what seems like a good idea to us?
And even just thinking about, once we start looking for where they are in the journey, sometimes being able to go, you know what? God is leading them really well. I'm good. I can just, be
Company.
a company. I don't have to be the leader here, that God is already leading, and I can just kind of hang out for
Be there. In fact, God has a funny way of turning up when we least expect him. And that has happened over and over in the Bible story. And that's some of what we would like to explore in this series 2 of Working the Word. So we're on a journey of discovery. We want to find out where God's at work, what God's given to us, what our strengths and abilities and God-given gifts are.
and how to use them best and work with them to, work into his purpose, as opposed to just kind of stumbling along and trying to connect the dots a little bit. That it's a cohesive picture that is unfolding rather than...
And it's going to be interesting to see what we discover, because we don't know. We are seeing some patterns beginning to emerge, and we'll share those with you. But come along on the journey with us as we keep on working the Word and discovering what we can learn about the God of the Bible.